The dinner rush at the Sterling had reached its crescendo, and Marcus Chun moved through the elegant dining room with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate chaos with calm precision. Crystal stemware caught the warm light from the brass chandeliers overhead, casting delicate patterns across white tablecloths that had been pressed to perfection. The soft murmur of conversations in 3 languages filled the air, punctuated by the gentle clink of silverware against fine china and the occasional burst of laughter from the corner booth where a tech executive was celebrating a merger. Marcus paused at table 12, where an elderly couple from Germany was struggling with the wine list. Without missing a beat, he switched to fluent German, his voice warm and respectful as he guided them through the selections. The woman's face lit up with delight, and she clasped her husband's hand as Marcus recommended a vintage that would pair perfectly with their anniversary dinner. His suggestion was not random. Marcus had studied the wine regions of France during his sabbatical years ago, back when he had sabbaticals to take in a corner office overlooking the Charles River. Those days felt like someone else's life now. The corner office, the tenure-track position at Harvard Business School, the startup he had co-founded that was supposed to change how companies treated their employees. All of it had crumbled when his business partner had chosen profit over principle, leaving Marcus to face congressional hearings and financial ruin while protecting the jobs of 63 people who had trusted him with their livelihoods. But that was then, and this was now. Now there was Emma, his 80-year-old daughter whose laugh could light up their tiny apartment above the laundromat. Now there was honest work that paid the bills and kept food on their table. Now there was dignity in service, something he had learned to appreciate in ways his former academic colleagues would never understand. The kitchen doors swung open with their familiar whoosh, and Marcus collected the plates for table 7. The seared duck breast gleamed under the warming lights, its skin crackling and golden, accompanied by a delicate arrangement of roasted vegetables that Chef Miguel had arranged like a small work of art. Miguel caught his eye and nodded, a gesture of respect that had taken months to earn. The kitchen staff had been suspicious of Marcus at first, wondering why someone who spoke like a professor was working alongside them. But when he had stayed late to help prep vegetables during Miguel's family emergency, when he had covered weekend shifts without complaint, when he had quietly loaned Carlos money for his daughter's school uniform, they had begun to see him as family. Table 7 received their entrees with the kind of enthusiasm that made the long hours worthwhile. Marcus ensured their water glasses were full, checked that the temperature was acceptable, and moved on to his next table without lingering. He had learned the delicate balance of attentive service, being present when needed and invisible when not. The evening light filtering through the tall windows had deepened to a rich amber, and Marcus allowed himself a moment to appreciate the beauty of the scene. Where in the world are you watching from tonight, he wondered, thinking of Emma's fascination with geography and her dream of traveling to every continent. She would be finishing her homework now, probably at the kitchen table in their small apartment, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she worked through her math problems. Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs would be checking on her soon, part of the informal network of care they had built in their neighborhood where single parents looked out for each other's children. The Sterling's heavy oak door opened with a soft chime, and Marcus glanced up from polishing water spots off a wine glass. The evening was far from over, and each new customer brought fresh possibilities and challenges. He straightened his black vest, smoothed his tie, and prepared to greet whoever had just entered their small world of carefully orchestrated hospitality. The woman who walked through the door commanded attention without effort. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor with the rhythm of someone accustomed to having others adjust their pace to match hers. Her silver hair was pulled back in a style that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week, and her tailored suit spoke of boardrooms and corner offices and decisions that affected thousands of lives with the stroke of a pen. She paused in the entrance, surveying the dining room with the calculating gaze of someone who measured everything in terms of efficiency and return on investment. Her eyes swept past the soft lighting, the carefully arranged flowers, the quiet conversations, and Marcus could almost see her mental calculator working, estimating revenues and profit margins and whether this establishment met her exacting standards. James Wellington, the owner, appeared from behind the host stand with the kind of smile he reserved for their most distinguished guests. Marcus had worked at the Sterling long enough to recognize the subtle shift in atmosphere that occurred when someone truly powerful entered the room. Conversations became slightly more subdued, staff moved with even greater precision, and there was an almost imperceptible adjustment in the energy of the space. The woman exchanged brief words with James, gesturing toward the prime table near the window that offered the best view of the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. As they moved across the dining room, Marcus noticed how other diners glanced up, some with recognition, others with the curiosity that wealth and power naturally attracted. He finished setting up table 15 and checked his section one more time. Everything was perfect, from the precise placement of the silverware to the soft glow of the votive candles. In a few minutes, James would approach him with that particular expression that meant he was about to be assigned to a table that required extra attention, extra care, and probably extra patience. Marcus Chen had served captains of industry before, back when he had been one himself, hosting dinners for potential investors and board members. He understood the weight of expectation that followed people accustomed to having their smallest desires anticipated and fulfilled. What he had learned in his months at the Sterling was that excellent service was about more than just bringing food to a table. It was about creating an experience, about making each guest feel valued and cared for, about the small details that transformed a meal into a memory. The evening stretched ahead of him, full of possibility and purpose. Somewhere across the city, Emma was probably getting ready for bed, maybe reading one of the books they had checked out from the library last weekend. Tomorrow he would walk her to school, and she would tell him about her day over dinner, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm that made every sacrifice worthwhile. For now, though, there was work to do, and Marcus Chen approached it with the same quiet excellence he brought to everything in his carefully rebuilt life. James Wellington approached Marcus with the measured steps of a man about to deliver delicate instructions. His usual warm demeanor had shifted into the professional mask he wore when managing high-stakes situations, and Marcus recognized the signs immediately. 20 years in the restaurant business had taught James how to read people, and the woman now seated at table 3 required careful handling. "That's Victoria Sterling," James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as they stood near the service station. "Sterling Industries, you've probably seen her on the business channels. She's particular about service, expects perfection, and has very little patience for mistakes. I'm assigning her table to you because you handle pressure well, but Marcus, she can be challenging. Just remember, the customer experience is everything, no matter how demanding they become." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of the assignment. He had served demanding clients before, both in his current role and in his previous life when he had entertained investors and board members. The key was anticipation, reading needs before they were expressed, and maintaining composure regardless of how the interaction unfolded. He gathered the leather-bound menus and approached table 3 with confident steps. Victoria Sterling sat with perfect posture, her manicured fingers already drumming against the white tablecloth in a rhythm that suggested impatience was her default setting. 2 associates flanked her, both younger, both wearing the slightly tense expressions of people accustomed to walking on eggshells around their boss. "Good evening," Marcus said warmly, placing the menus before them with practiced precision. "Welcome to the Sterling. My name is Marcus, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. May I start you with something to drink, or would you prefer a moment to review our wine selection?" Victoria's eyes swept over him with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a piece of equipment. "Water," she said curtly, "no ice, room temperature, in a clean glass. Not the glasses you've been using for other tables, a fresh one from the back. And I'll need to see your wine list immediately. Not the regular one, the reserve list that James keeps for serious collectors." Her associates shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus noticed how they avoided making eye contact with him, as if apologizing for their boss's brusque manner without actually speaking. He maintained his professional smile, unfazed by her tone. The hospitality industry had taught him that some people used rudeness as a way to establish dominance, testing whether service staff would maintain their professionalism under pressure. "Of course," Marcus replied smoothly. "I'll bring your water right away, and I'll get the reserve wine list for you to review. In the meantime, would your guests like anything to drink?" "They'll have what I'm having," Victoria said without consulting them. "And make sure the water is actually room temperature." I can tell the difference between room temperature and refrigerated water that's been sitting out for 10 minutes. Marcus nodded and retreated to the service station, where he carefully selected 3 pristine glasses from the back shelf and filled them with water from the room temperature dispenser they kept specifically for such requests. He retrieved the leather-bound reserve wine list from James's office, checking to ensure every page was clean and properly aligned. When he returned to the table, Victoria was explaining something to her associates in the clipped tones of someone delivering a lecture rather than having a conversation. She barely glanced up as he placed the glasses and wine list before them, but he noticed her quick inspection of the water glass, checking for spots or fingerprints. The reserve list featured wines that cost more than Marcus made in a month, bottles that had been carefully selected for their rarity and prestige. Victoria flipped through the pages with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for, occasionally making small sounds of approval or dismissal. "This Chateau Margaux," she said finally, pointing to a bottle priced at $800. "What year did you last serve this, and how has it been stored? I want to know the exact temperature of your wine cellar and how long this particular bottle has been in your inventory." The questions came rapidly, each one designed to test his knowledge and attention to detail. Marcus answered each one precisely, drawing on both his training at the Sterling and his broader understanding of wine cultivation and storage that he had acquired during his academic sabbaticals in France. His responses were thorough but concise, demonstrating competence without being condescending. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, perhaps surprised by the depth of his knowledge, but she quickly returned to her commanding demeanor. "Fine," she said. "We'll have that bottle. And for appetizers, I want to see everything you have that's not on the regular menu. I assume you have special preparations that you don't advertise to casual diners." The evening continued in this pattern, with Victoria issuing increasingly complex requests and specifications. She wanted her salad prepared with a specific type of vinegar that wasn't typically stocked, demanded that her salmon be cooked to an exact temperature that required careful coordination with the kitchen, and insisted on modifications to every dish that pushed the boundaries of what was normally possible. Marcus handled each request with calm efficiency, coordinating with Chef Miguel and the kitchen staff to accommodate her demands. He could see the stress building among the other servers as word spread about the challenging table, but he remained focused on providing excellent service regardless of the difficulty involved. What struck him most wasn't Victoria's demanding nature, which he had encountered before, but the way she seemed to view the entire restaurant staff as interchangeable parts in a machine designed solely for her convenience. There was no acknowledgement of the extra effort required to fulfill her requests, no recognition that the people serving her were individuals with their own expertise and dignity. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself thinking about Emma and the lessons he tried to teach her about treating everyone with respect, regardless of their role or position. He wondered what his daughter would think of someone who wielded power without grace, who confused authority with superiority. The stage was being set for something more significant than a difficult dining experience, though Marcus couldn't yet see how the evening would unfold. He simply focused on doing his job well, maintaining his professionalism, and ensuring that every detail met the exacting standards that Victoria Sterling demanded. The real test, he sensed, was still to come. The first sign of trouble came when the kitchen doors swung open without Marcus emerging immediately behind them. Chef Miguel appeared instead, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the tense expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. He approached Marcus at the service station with quick, purposeful steps that suggested urgency. "We have a problem with table 3, Miguel said quietly, wiping his hands on his apron. "The duck breast she ordered, the supplier delivered it this morning, but it's not up to our standards. I can prepare an exceptional salmon instead, maybe the halibut with the truffle reduction, but the duck will take 45 minutes minimum if I'm going to serve something worthy of this restaurant." Marcus felt his stomach tighten slightly, understanding immediately how this news would be received at table 3. Victoria Sterling had made it clear that she expected perfection without delay, and any deviation from her precise order would likely trigger the kind of reaction that could disturb the entire dining room. He glanced across the restaurant toward her table, where she was gesturing emphatically while explaining something to her increasingly uncomfortable associates. "I'll handle it," Marcus said, straightening his shoulders. Prepare the salmon exactly as you would for your most discerning customer. I'll explain the situation and offer alternatives that will exceed her expectations." Miguel nodded, but concern remained etched across his weathered features. "That woman, she doesn't seem like the understanding type. Be careful, my friend. Some people look for reasons to explode, and this might be the spark she's been waiting for." Marcus understood the warning, but there was no avoiding the conversation. He had learned long ago that difficult news didn't improve with delay, and honesty delivered with confidence and alternatives was always better than excuses. He approached table 3 with steady steps, preparing to explain the situation with the professionalism that had carried him through countless challenging moments. "Ms. Sterling," he began respectfully, "I need to inform you about a slight adjustment to your order. Our chef has determined that tonight's duck doesn't meet our exacting standards for preparation. However, I'd like to recommend our Atlantic salmon with herb crust, or perhaps the halibut with truffle reduction, both of which are exceptional this evening and can be prepared to your exact specifications." The change in Victoria's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes narrowed into sharp points of displeasure, and the temperature at table 3 seemed to drop several degrees. The conversations at nearby tables began to quiet as other diners sensed the shift in atmosphere, their attention drawn by the sudden tension radiating from the prime table near the window. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than outright shouting. "Did you just tell me that the dish I specifically ordered, after waiting 25 minutes, is not available? Are you seriously suggesting that I settle for something else because your kitchen failed to properly source ingredients?" Her associates had stopped eating entirely, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths as they recognized the warning signs of an approaching storm. The younger woman looked particularly distressed, clearly familiar with her boss's temper and the collateral damage it could cause. Marcus maintained his composure, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "I understand your disappointment, and I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Our chef maintains extremely high standards, and rather than serve you something that wouldn't represent the best of what we can offer, he wanted to ensure you received a meal that would exceed your expectations. The salmon I mentioned is particularly exceptional tonight, and I'd be happy to have it prepared exactly to your preferences." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless, cutting through the restaurant's ambient noise like a blade. "This is exactly the kind of incompetence I've come to expect from establishments that prioritize excuses over execution. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand that I could buy this entire restaurant and fire every single person in it before dessert arrives?" The dining room had grown noticeably quieter, with conversations at neighboring tables dying away as patrons began to focus on the unfolding drama. Marcus was acutely aware that they had become the center of attention, that whatever happened next would be witnessed by dozens of people who had come here for a peaceful evening out. "I absolutely understand your frustration," Marcus replied calmly, his years of experience in high-pressure situations helping him maintain his professional demeanor. "You're right to expect excellence, and that's exactly what we want to provide. If you'll allow me, I'd like to speak with Chef Miguel about expediting a replacement that will more than compensate for this delay." Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with enough force to make several nearby diners turn their heads. Her face had flushed with anger, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the restaurant with unmistakable authority and disdain. "Don't you dare patronize me with your customer service scripts," she said, her words dripping with contempt. "This is exactly what's wrong with the service industry today. People who have no business handling sophisticated clientele trying to manage situations they're completely unqualified to understand. I specifically chose this restaurant because James Wellington assured me it maintained certain standards, and instead I'm dealing with incompetent staff who think apologies substitute for competence." Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant upon him, sensing the collective intake of breath as the confrontation escalated beyond the bounds of normal customer service challenges. He thought briefly of Emma, wondering what she would want him to do in this moment, how she would expect her father to respond when faced with such public humiliation. The professional mask he had worn throughout his career, both in academia and in hospitality, remained firmly in place. He would not allow this woman's anger to provoke him into losing his dignity, regardless of how far she chose to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. "Ms. Sterling," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone, "I want to make this right for you. Please, let me find a solution that will turn this evening into the exceptional experience you deserve." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus could see in Victoria's eyes that she had moved beyond the point where reasonable solutions would satisfy her anger. The stage was set for an escalation that would test everything he believed about maintaining grace under pressure, about the dignity of honest work, and about the strength that comes from refusing to respond to cruelty with cruelty. The restaurant held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Victoria Sterling's voice rose another octave, cutting through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere like a knife through silk. The elegant dining room, which moments before had been filled with the gentle murmur of sophisticated conversation, now hung in suspended silence as every patron turned their attention to the unfolding spectacle near the window table. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Victoria declared, her words carrying to every corner of the room. "I am Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, and I did not build a billion-dollar empire by accepting mediocrity from people who clearly don't understand what real service means. This is exactly the kind of incompetence that explains why some people spend their entire lives in menial positions while others rise to positions of actual importance." Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that conveyed both respect and quiet strength. Years of dealing with difficult situations had taught him that responding to anger with anger only escalated conflicts, and he was determined to maintain his professionalism regardless of how far Victoria chose to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The other diners watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, some clearly recognizing Victoria from business news coverage, others simply witnessing what appeared to be a wealthy woman's complete meltdown over a restaurant order. The elderly German couple Marcus had helped earlier looked particularly distressed, the woman whispering something to her husband in their native language while shooting sympathetic glances toward Marcus. James Wellington appeared from his office, drawn by the commotion that was threatening to disrupt his carefully maintained atmosphere of refined hospitality. His face showed the strain of someone trying to balance customer satisfaction with employee protection, knowing that both his reputation and his staff's dignity hung in the balance of how this situation was resolved. Victoria noticed his approach and immediately redirected her fury toward him. "James," she said with icy precision, "is this really the caliber of staff you're employing at what's supposed to be a premier establishment? Because if this is the level of service I can expect, I'll be sure to share my experience with everyone in my extensive network of business associates and social connections." The threat hung in the air like a sword, and Marcus could see the tension in James's shoulders as he processed the potential damage to his restaurant's reputation. Sterling Industries wielded considerable influence in the city's business community, and Victoria's displeasure could indeed impact the Sterling standing among its most valuable clientele. "Ma'am," James began carefully, "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced this evening. Marcus is one of our most professional servers, and I'm confident we can resolve this situation to your complete satisfaction. Please, allow me to personally ensure that your dining experience exceeds your expectations." Victoria turned back to Marcus with renewed venom, her earlier restraint completely abandoned. "Don't you understand what's happening here?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your boss is trying to save your job because he knows that someone with your obvious limitations would be unemployable anywhere else. This is what happens when restaurants hire people who lack the education, the breeding, the basic intelligence to understand what hospitality actually means." The words hit the dining room like physical blows, and Marcus felt something shift in the atmosphere around him. Several patrons had stopped eating entirely, their faces showing disgust at Victoria's behavior rather than sympathy for her position. A woman at table 7 shook her head in visible dismay, while a businessman near the bar muttered something under his breath that sounded distinctly disapproving. Victoria was just getting started. "Look at you," she continued, gesturing dismissively at Marcus. "Standing there in your little uniform, pretending to understand concepts like excellence and standards. Do you have any idea what it takes to build something significant in this world? The education, the strategic thinking, the ability to make decisions that affect thousands of people and millions of dollars? Of course you don't, because people like you are followers, not leaders. You take orders because that's all you're capable of doing. Marcus felt the familiar weight of public humiliation, remembering congressional hearings where politicians had attacked his character and competence while cameras rolled and reporters took notes. But this felt different, more personal, because Victoria was attacking not just his professional capabilities but his fundamental worth as a human being. The restaurant had become completely silent except for Victoria's voice, which seemed to echo off the walls with each cruel pronouncement. Even her own associates looked mortified, the younger woman staring at her hands while the man beside her shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he could disappear entirely. And another thing, Victoria pressed on, her anger feeding on itself like a fire consuming oxygen. I can tell just by looking at you that you're probably a single parent, struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs because you never developed any real skills or qualifications. That's not my problem, that's the result of poor life choices and a complete lack of ambition or intelligence. The word struck deeper than Victoria could have known, hitting directly at the core of Marcus's current reality and the sacrifices he had made to protect his daughter's future. He thought of Emma, probably asleep now in their small apartment, trusting that her father would always find a way to provide for her and protect her from the harsh judgments of a world that often measured worth by wealth and status rather than character and integrity. Something crystallized in Marcus's mind at that moment, a clarity that came from being pushed past the point where silence served any constructive purpose. He had maintained his composure through professional criticism, through financial ruin, through the collapse of his academic career, but watching this woman attack the dignity of honest work and the worth of struggling parents touched something fundamental in his core beliefs about human value and respect. The entire restaurant seemed to lean forward slightly, sensing that the dynamic was about to shift, that the quiet man in the server's uniform was reaching a decision point that would determine how this confrontation would ultimately resolve. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, his years of teaching and leadership experience beginning to surface beneath his carefully maintained exterior of humble service. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and everyone in the Sterling was about to discover who Marcus Chun really was. The silence in the Sterling stretched like a held breath, thick with anticipation and discomfort. Victoria Sterling stood with her arms crossed, radiating the satisfaction of someone who believed she had thoroughly demolished her target, while Marcus remained perfectly still, his composure intact despite the verbal assault he had just endured. The other diners watched with a mixture of horror and fascination, witnessing what had become less a customer service interaction and more a public execution of human dignity. Then Victoria crossed a line that changed everything. "You know what your real problem is," she said with cruel precision, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed restaurant. "You're probably one of those deadbeat fathers who thinks that working a dead-end job makes you some kind of hero. But your daughter, if you even have custody of her, is going to grow up ashamed of having a father who peaked as a waiter. She'll spend her whole life making excuses for why her dad never amounted to anything, why he couldn't provide her with the opportunities that children of successful people take for granted." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, striking directly at the heart of every fear he carried as a single parent trying to rebuild his life while protecting his daughter's future. He thought of Emma's bright eyes, her trust in him, her innocent questions about why they had moved from their big house to the small apartment, and her unwavering belief that her father was the strongest, smartest, most capable man in the world. Something shifted in Marcus's posture, subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and when he looked up from the floor where his gaze had been fixed during Victoria's tirade, there was something different in his eyes. The deferential service worker had been replaced by something else entirely, though his voice when he spoke remained calm and measured. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, his words carrying with surprising clarity across the silent dining room, "I wonder if I might have your permission to respond to what you've just said." The request was so unexpected, so politely phrased despite the circumstances, that Victoria actually paused mid-breath. She had been preparing to launch another attack, but something in Marcus's tone gave her pause. Around the restaurant, diners leaned forward slightly, sensing that the dynamic was about to shift in an unexpected direction. "Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for their dignity?" Marcus continued, his voice still respectful but carrying an undercurrent of quiet authority that hadn't been there moments before. Because what you're witnessing right now is a moment that happens in every generation, when someone decides that silence in the face of cruelty is no longer an option. Victoria's eyes narrowed, perhaps sensing that she was losing control of the narrative she had been directing. "What exactly do you think you're going to say that could possibly matter?" she snapped. "You're a waiter. Your opinion about anything beyond taking orders and bringing food is completely irrelevant." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words with genuine attention. "You're absolutely right about one thing," he said. "I am a waiter. Tonight, in this restaurant, that's exactly what I am. And there's honor in that work, dignity in serving others, value in doing any honest job with excellence and integrity." He paused, and when he continued, there was something in his voice that made even Victoria stop talking and listen. "But what you've demonstrated tonight isn't the behavior of someone who understands what real success looks like. True leadership, genuine achievement, actual class, these things are measured not by how you treat people who can benefit you, but by how you treat people who can do nothing for you at all." The restaurant had become completely still, every conversation abandoned as diners found themselves drawn into what was becoming less a customer service interaction and more a masterclass in human dignity. James Wellington stood frozen near the host's stand, recognizing that something extraordinary was unfolding but uncertain whether to intervene or allow it to continue. Marcus's voice grew slightly stronger, though it never lost its respectful tone. "You mentioned education and breeding, ma'am. Let me share something I learned from my own education. The ancient Greeks had a concept called hubris, the kind of arrogance that comes from believing your position makes you superior to other human beings. They considered it the most dangerous character flaw a person could possess, because it blinds you to your own limitations and prevents you from learning, growing, or connecting authentically with others." Victoria's mouth opened as if to interrupt, but something in Marcus's presence had changed so fundamentally that the words didn't come. The man standing before her was no longer the deferential service worker she had been attacking. Without raising his voice or abandoning his respectful manner, he had somehow claimed space in the conversation, transformed himself from victim to educator. "You spoke about my daughter," Marcus continued, and his voice carried a note of gentle steel that made several diners sit up straighter in their chairs. "Let me tell you about her. She's 8 years old, and she speaks 3 languages fluently. She reads at a high school level, not because I push her, but because she's curious about everything and believes that knowledge is the greatest gift anyone can receive. She volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends, she helps elderly neighbors carry groceries, and she treats every person she meets with the kind of respect and kindness that some adults never learn to demonstrate." The words flowed with increasing confidence, and Marcus found himself drawing on reserves of strength he hadn't accessed in months. This wasn't about defending himself anymore, it was about defending something larger, more important, more fundamental to who he was as a person and as a father. "When she asks me about my work, I tell her that I'm fortunate to have a job that allows me to take care of people, to make their evenings a little brighter, to be part of moments that matter to them. I tell her that there's no shame in honest work, no hierarchy of human worth based on job titles or bank accounts, and that the measure of a person's character is found in how they treat others, especially those who have less power or privilege than they do." Victoria's face had gone through several changes during Marcus's response, moving from shock to anger to something that might have been the beginning of recognition. Around the restaurant, other diners were watching with rapt attention, some nodding slightly at his words, others looking uncomfortable as they reflected on their own attitudes toward service workers and social hierarchies. Marcus wasn't finished. "Tonight, you've given me an opportunity to demonstrate something important for my daughter and for everyone else in this room. You've shown us what happens when someone confuses wealth with worth, when they mistake position for character, when they believe that having power over others gives them the right to diminish other human beings." The transformation in Marcus's presence was becoming undeniable. What had begun as a respectful response was evolving into something far more profound, and everyone in the Sterling could sense the shift. His voice carried the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to speaking with authority, someone who had spent years thinking deeply about leadership, human nature, and the dynamics of power. "You see," Marcus continued, his words flowing with increasing confidence, true leadership isn't about having the loudest voice in the room or the biggest bank account. It's about understanding that your position is a responsibility, not a weapon. It's about recognizing that every person you encounter has intrinsic worth that has nothing to do with their current circumstances or job title. Victoria stood frozen, her earlier fury replaced by something approaching bewilderment. This wasn't the cowering response she had expected from her verbal assault. The man before her was speaking with the kind of measured authority that she associated with boardrooms and lecture halls, not restaurant service stations. Marcus gestured slightly toward the dining room around them, his movement encompassing the other patrons who were hanging on his every word. In my experience, he said, the most successful organizations, the ones that create lasting value rather than short-term profit, are built on a foundation of mutual respect. They understand that excellence comes from empowering people, not diminishing them. They recognize that the person serving your dinner tonight might have insights that could transform your business tomorrow, if you're wise enough to listen. James Wellington found himself nodding involuntarily, recognizing wisdom that went far beyond typical customer service training. Several diners had abandoned any pretense of eating, their attention completely focused on what was becoming an impromptu lesson in leadership and human dignity. The elderly German couple was watching with particular intensity, the woman's eyes bright with appreciation for what she was witnessing. At table 7, a young businesswoman had quietly pulled out her phone, not to record, but to take notes on what Marcus was saying, recognizing insights that could apply to her own professional challenges. Victoria tried to regain control of the conversation. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier venom. "You're a waiter giving me a lecture about business? Do you have any idea what I've accomplished, what I've built?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sure you've achieved remarkable things," he replied with genuine respect. "Building a successful company requires intelligence, determination, and the ability to make difficult decisions. Those are admirable qualities, and I don't diminish them. But tonight, you've demonstrated something else entirely. You've shown how easily success can be undermined by the belief that it gives you license to treat others as inferior." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room like gentle rain on parched ground. The restaurant remained absolutely silent, every person present recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when ordinary circumstances had given rise to profound truth. Marcus's voice took on the tone of someone who had spent years in classrooms, helping others understand complex concepts. "Consider this scenario," he said. "You walk into a restaurant and encounter poor service. You have several options. You can respond with anger and humiliation, using your position to make someone else feel small. Or you can respond with clarity and firmness, addressing the issue while maintaining the dignity of everyone involved. The first approach might give you a momentary sense of power, but it diminishes everyone in the room, including yourself. The second approach solves the problem while preserving human dignity and actually demonstrates the kind of leadership that creates lasting respect." Victoria's associates had stopped trying to disappear into their chairs and were now listening with the same rapt attention as everyone else in the restaurant. The younger woman looked particularly struck by Marcus's words, perhaps reflecting on meetings and interactions she had witnessed or participated in at Sterling Industries. "But here's what's even more important," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about the lesson he was teaching. "Every person in this room tonight has a story. The busboy clearing tables might be working his way through medical school. The hostess might be supporting her elderly parents while pursuing her art. The chef might have sacrificed everything to perfect his craft and create moments of joy for others through food." He gestured toward the kitchen doors, where several staff members had quietly appeared, drawn by the commotion but staying respectfully in the background. "These people aren't failures or disappointments or examples of limited ambition. They're human beings with dreams, responsibilities, talents, and worth that exists completely independent of how much money they make or what title appears on their business card." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Marcus could see their impact rippling through the dining room. Several patrons were looking around with new awareness, perhaps seeing the restaurant staff with different eyes, recognizing the humanity in people they might normally overlook. Victoria's face had gone through another transformation, her anger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shame. For the first time all evening, she seemed to be listening rather than simply waiting for her turn to attack, and Marcus could see the wheels turning behind her eyes as she processed what he was saying. Marcus wasn't finished, but his tone remained gentle, educational rather than accusatory. The most successful leaders I've known, the ones who built things that lasted and created value for everyone around them, understood that their primary job was to see and develop the potential in others. They knew that their legacy wouldn't be measured by how much they accumulated, but by how much they contributed to the growth and well-being of the people whose lives they touched. The lesson was being delivered with such quiet authority, such obvious depth of understanding, that even Victoria found herself unable to interrupt. Marcus had somehow claimed the moral high ground not through aggression or confrontation, but through the simple power of wisdom delivered with compassion and respect. Around the dining room, people were beginning to exchange glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare and valuable, a moment when truth was spoken with such clarity that it cut through pretense and touched something fundamental about what it meant to be human. Marcus paused for a moment, his gaze moving thoughtfully across the faces in the dining room before returning to Victoria. When he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who had spent years thinking deeply about organizational behavior, leadership theory, and the complex dynamics that determine whether institutions thrive or merely survive. "There's a principle in organizational psychology," he said, his words flowing with the natural ease of someone revisiting familiar territory, called the fundamental attribution error. It's the tendency to judge others by their actions while judging ourselves by our intentions. When we see someone struggling, we assume it's because of their character flaws or lack of ability. When we struggle ourselves, we know it's because of circumstances beyond our control. Victoria's eyes had widened slightly, her business-trained mind recognizing concepts that weren't typically part of a server's vocabulary. Around the restaurant, several diners leaned forward, sensing that they were receiving an education in human nature from an unexpected source. Marcus continued with growing confidence, drawing on years of classroom experience and research that had shaped his understanding of how people and organizations really functioned. "The most effective leaders I've studied, whether in academic research or real-world observation, share one crucial characteristic. They understand that their success depends entirely on their ability to see past surface appearances and recognize the potential that exists in every person they encounter." He gestured subtly toward James Wellington, who was listening with the intense attention of someone realizing that his employee possessed depths he had never suspected. "Consider this restaurant," Marcus said. "Its success doesn't depend on any single person, but on the collective excellence of everyone who contributes to the experience. The hostess who makes guests feel welcome, the busboy who ensures tables are perfectly prepared, the chef who transforms ingredients into art, the servers who anticipate needs and create connections. Each person is essential, and dismissing any of them diminishes the whole." The words were delivered with such natural authority that even Victoria found herself nodding slightly, her business mind engaging with concepts that resonated despite her earlier hostility. Marcus had shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation, transforming what had been a humiliating confrontation into something approaching a masterclass in leadership philosophy. "What part of this story resonates most with you?" Marcus asked, his question directed not just to Victoria but to everyone within hearing. "Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you based on limited information? Have you ever realized that you were making assumptions about others based on circumstances you didn't fully understand?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus could see people throughout the restaurant reflecting on their own experiences, their own moments of being misunderstood or of misunderstanding others. The elderly German woman nodded knowingly, perhaps remembering times when her accent had led to assumptions about her intelligence or education. Marcus drew on his years of teaching experience, knowing how to create moments of reflection that could shift perspectives permanently. "In the classroom and the boardroom," he continued, his casual reference to both environments delivered so naturally that it might have been overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, "I've seen brilliant insights come from the most unexpected sources. The quiet student who rarely speaks but sees patterns others miss. The junior employee who understands customer needs better than the executive team. The person whose current position doesn't reflect their full capabilities or potential. Victoria was listening now with the intensity of someone recognizing expertise, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching respect. The transformation was visible to everyone watching, a real-time demonstration of how genuine wisdom could shift even the most entrenched attitudes. Marcus's voice took on the warmth of someone sharing hard-won understanding. True leadership isn't about having all the answers or being the smartest person in the room. It's about creating environments where everyone can contribute their best thinking, where diverse perspectives are valued, where people feel safe to share ideas without fear of ridicule or dismissal. He paused, his eyes meeting Victoria's directly for the first time since his response had begun. The Marcus standing before her now bore little resemblance to the deferential server she had been attacking minutes earlier. This was someone who understood power dynamics from both sides, who had clearly spent years thinking about what separated effective leaders from merely successful ones. The most dangerous trap for anyone in a position of authority, Marcus continued, is believing that your title or wealth or influence makes you inherently superior to others. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt the people around you, it actually undermines your own effectiveness. It blinds you to information you need, alienates people whose support you require, and creates the kind of toxic culture that destroys organizations from within. Several businesspeople in the dining room were taking mental notes, recognizing insights that could transform their own leadership approaches. The young woman at table 7 had pulled out her phone again, this time clearly capturing some of Marcus's words for future reference. Marcus drew on his deepest understanding of human motivation and organizational behavior. People don't just want paychecks, he said. They want to feel valued, to know that their contributions matter, to believe that they're part of something meaningful. The leaders who understand this, who treat every interaction as an opportunity to recognize and develop human potential, those are the ones who build things that last. Victoria's entire posture had changed during Marcus's response. The imperious anger that had defined her earlier behavior had been replaced by something approaching humility, as if she was seeing herself and her actions through new eyes for the first time in years. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus concluded, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned these lessons through both triumph and failure, true success isn't measured by how much you can take from the world, but by how much you can contribute to it. It's not about being served, but about serving something larger than yourself. The restaurant remained absolutely silent, every person present recognizing that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Marcus had taken what began as a customer service disaster and transformed it into a profound lesson about leadership, dignity, and the fundamental respect that every human being deserved. Victoria Sterling stood there, no longer the commanding presence who had entered the restaurant hours earlier, but someone who was beginning to understand that she had encountered wisdom that her wealth and position had never been able to purchase. The silence that followed Marcus's words was unlike anything the Sterling had ever experienced. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of conflict, but the profound stillness that comes when truth has been spoken with such clarity that it demands reflection. Victoria Sterling stood motionless, her earlier fury completely extinguished, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like the beginning of self-awareness. Marcus took a gentle breath, his composure absolute, and when he continued speaking, there was something different in his tone. The respectful deference was still there, but underneath it was the unmistakable confidence of someone who had spent years helping others understand complex truths about themselves and their organizations. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, his voice carrying the reflective quality of someone drawing on deep experience, I remember a case study I used to teach about a CEO who prided herself on being demanding and uncompromising. She believed that fear motivated excellence, that keeping people off balance made them work harder. For a while, her company's numbers looked impressive. Victoria's eyes sharpened, recognizing the academic language even as she wondered where a restaurant server would have encountered such material. Around the dining room, other patrons found themselves drawn into what was becoming less a customer service interaction and more a sophisticated analysis of leadership and human behavior. Marcus continued with the natural ease of someone who had spent countless hours in front of classrooms full of MBA students. But what this CEO didn't understand was that fear-based leadership creates a culture of compliance, not innovation. People stop taking risks, stop offering creative solutions, stop bringing their best thinking to work because they're too busy protecting themselves from the next verbal assault. The words flowed with increasing authority, and several business professionals in the restaurant began exchanging glances, recognizing insights that went far beyond typical management training. Marcus was speaking from a depth of knowledge that suggested extensive study of organizational behavior and leadership theory. The company started losing its best talent, Marcus explained, his tone taking on the patient quality of an experienced educator. Not all at once, but gradually. The people with options, the ones with real skills and creativity, they found environments where their contributions were valued rather than criticized. What remained were the people who felt they had no choice but to stay, and you can imagine how that affected innovation and performance. Victoria found herself nodding slightly, perhaps recognizing patterns from her own organization that she had never considered from this perspective. The man before her was demonstrating a level of insight into corporate dynamics that was both surprising and unsettling, given her earlier assumptions about his capabilities and background. Marcus drew on years of research and teaching experience. The fascinating thing about this case, he continued, was how the CEO's personal insecurities drove her behavior. She had grown up feeling powerless, and achieving success gave her the opportunity to make others feel the way she once had. But power used to diminish others ultimately diminishes the person wielding it. The analysis was delivered with the kind of nuanced understanding that comes from years of studying human motivation and organizational psychology. Marcus wasn't just sharing an anecdote, he was providing a sophisticated framework for understanding how personal history shapes leadership behavior. James Wellington stood transfixed, realizing that his employee possessed depths of knowledge and experience that went far beyond anything revealed in his job application or interviews. The other staff members who had gathered near the kitchen doors were equally amazed, watching their colleague demonstrate expertise that transformed their understanding of who he really was. "What makes this relevant to tonight," Marcus said, his gaze returning to Victoria with gentle directness, "is that real leadership requires the courage to examine our own motivations. It means asking ourselves whether we're using our position to create value or simply to feel powerful. It means recognizing that how we treat others reflects who we are, not who they are." The lesson was being delivered with such quiet authority that even Victoria's associates were listening with rapt attention, perhaps reflecting on meetings and decisions they had witnessed at Sterling Industries. The younger woman looked particularly thoughtful, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in her mind. Marcus's voice took on the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about helping others grow and improve. "In my experience teaching leadership principles," he said, the phrase slipping out so naturally that it might have been missed by anyone not paying close attention, "the most transformative moments come when we're willing to acknowledge that our current approach isn't serving us or the people around us." Victoria's eyes widened at the casual reference to teaching, her business-trained mind beginning to process the implications of what she was hearing. This wasn't just theoretical knowledge or insights gleaned from business books. Marcus was speaking from direct experience, from years of helping others understand and apply these concepts. "The most successful leaders I've worked with," Marcus continued, his confidence growing as he drew on decades of experience in both academic and practical settings, share one crucial characteristic. They understand that their success is entirely dependent on their ability to bring out the best in others. They know that sustainable excellence comes from empowerment, not intimidation. Around the restaurant, phones had begun appearing in people's hands, not to record the confrontation for entertainment, but to capture insights that could transform their own professional relationships. The elderly German couple was listening with particular intensity, perhaps remembering their own experiences with different styles of leadership throughout their careers. Marcus delivered his next insight with the gentle precision of someone who had spent years helping students understand complex truths about human nature. "True influence," he said, "isn't about making people fear your displeasure. It's about inspiring them to want to exceed your expectations because they believe in the vision you've shared and trust that their contributions will be valued and recognized." The transformation in the dining room was palpable. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation had evolved into something approaching a masterclass in leadership philosophy, delivered by someone whose background was becoming increasingly mysterious and impressive with each word he spoke. Victoria Sterling stood there, no longer the commanding presence who had entered the restaurant, but someone beginning to realize that she had encountered wisdom and expertise that her position and wealth had never been able to purchase, delivered by a man whose true capabilities she was only beginning to understand. The moment of revelation came from an unexpected source. James Wellington, who had been listening with growing amazement to his employee's sophisticated analysis of leadership and human behavior, suddenly stepped forward with a look of recognition dawning across his face. "Marcus," James said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed dining room, "I think it's time these people knew who you really are." Victoria's head snapped toward the restaurant owner, her confusion evident as she tried to process what was happening. The entire dining room seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the mystery they had been witnessing was about to be resolved in a way that would explain everything they had just heard. James looked directly at Victoria, his expression serious and slightly protective of his employee. "Ms. Sterling," he said formally, "allow me to properly introduce Dr. Marcus Chen, former professor of organizational behavior and leadership at Harvard Business School, co-founder of Meridian Solutions, and one of the most respected voices in corporate ethics and sustainable business practices." The words hit the restaurant like a physical force. Victoria's mouth opened in shock, her face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something approaching horror as she began to understand the magnitude of her earlier behavior. Around the dining room, phones appeared as patrons quickly searched for information, confirming what James had just revealed. Marcus had gone very still, his carefully maintained anonymity suddenly stripped away. But rather than seeming embarrassed or defensive, he maintained the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire response to Victoria's attacks. James wasn't finished. "Dr. Chen lost everything," he continued, his voice carrying a note of deep respect, "when he refused to participate in a scheme that would have made him wealthy but would have cost 63 people their jobs. He chose to protect his employees rather than profit from their exploitation. He testified before Congress, faced financial ruin, and sacrificed his career to do what was right." The impact of this revelation rippled through the dining room like a wave. Several patrons were now openly searching their phones, pulling up articles and videos from the congressional hearings that had made national news 2 years earlier. The elderly German woman gasped softly, clearly remembering the story, while the young businesswoman at table 7 stared at Marcus with newfound understanding and respect. Victoria stood frozen, pieces of memory clicking into place. She remembered the headlines, the congressional testimony of a business professor who had blown the whistle on corporate fraud despite the personal cost. She remembered thinking at the time that he was naive, that he should have taken the money and stayed quiet. Now that same man was standing before her in a server's uniform, having just delivered a masterclass in the very principles he had sacrificed everything to uphold. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and without bitterness. "James," he said gently, "I asked you not to share that information. What happened before doesn't change who I am now or the value of the work I do here." But James shook his head firmly. "It changes everything," he replied. These people needed to understand that they were listening to someone who had literally put his principles before his profit, who had chosen integrity over influence, who had walked away from everything to protect others. Victoria's associates were now staring at their boss with expressions of shock and dawning mortification. The younger woman looked particularly stricken, perhaps realizing that she had just witnessed her CEO publicly humiliate one of the most respected experts in their field, someone whose research and writings had likely influenced the very business practices they claimed to follow. Marcus turned back to Victoria, his expression kind despite everything that had transpired. "Ms. Sterling," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I don't share this information to embarrass you or to claim some kind of moral superiority. I share it because I believe deeply in the capacity for people to grow, to learn, to become better versions of themselves when they're given the opportunity." The grace in his response was perhaps more devastating than any accusation could have been. Victoria realized that even now, after her vicious personal attacks, Marcus was offering her dignity and the possibility of redemption. Around the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as entertainment, watching a wealthy woman berate a server, had transformed into something profound and uncomfortable. People were forced to confront their own assumptions, their own prejudices, their own tendencies to judge others based on limited information. Marcus continued with the same gentle authority he had demonstrated throughout his response. "The reason I chose to work here," he explained, "isn't because I had no other options. It's because I learned something important about the dignity of honest work, about the value of serving others, about finding meaning in making people's lives a little brighter, even in small ways." Several patrons were visibly emotional now, recognizing the profound lesson they were receiving about humility, service, and the difference between success and significance. The viral nature of the moment was becoming apparent as more phones appeared, capturing not just Marcus's words but the transformation occurring throughout the dining room. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dr. Chen," she said, the title feeling strange and inadequate after everything that had happened. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Marcus nodded graciously, his response measured and kind. "Apologies are meaningful when they lead to change," he said. "What matters now isn't what happened tonight, but what you choose to do with this experience going forward." The restaurant remained absolutely silent, everyone present recognizing that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A man who had sacrificed everything for his principles had just demonstrated what true leadership looked like, not through position or power, but through character and grace under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Victoria Sterling stood there, her entire worldview shifting as she realized that the man she had tried to humiliate possessed more genuine authority and respect than she had ever earned, despite all her wealth and influence. Sarah Mitchell had been dining quietly at table 12 when the confrontation began, but now she held her phone with trembling hands, realizing that she had just captured something extraordinary. As a food blogger with a modest following, she had intended to review the Sterling's new seasonal menu. Instead, she had recorded what might become one of the most powerful examples of grace under pressure ever captured on video. The footage was remarkable not for its drama, but for its dignity. Marcus's entire response, from his request for permission to speak through the revelation of his identity, had been delivered with such quiet authority and compassion that even through her phone's camera, the moral weight of the moment was unmistakable. Sarah's fingers moved quickly across her screen as she uploaded the video to her social media accounts. Her caption was simple but powerful: "When a billionaire CEO attacks a restaurant server, she has no idea she's humiliating a Harvard professor who sacrificed everything to protect his employees. Watch what happens next. This is what real leadership looks like." Within minutes, the notifications on her phone began chiming with increasing frequency. The video was being shared, commented on, and spreading across platforms with the kind of velocity that marked truly viral content. But this wasn't going viral for its entertainment value or shock factor. People were sharing it because it contained something rare and valuable, an authentic example of dignity, wisdom, and grace that felt desperately needed in a world often characterized by cynicism and cruelty. Back in the restaurant, other diners were having similar reactions. The young businesswoman at table 7 had captured Marcus's key insights about leadership and was already sharing clips with her professional network. The elderly German couple had asked their grandson to help them post about the experience, wanting to celebrate a moment that reminded them of the kind of character they had admired in leaders throughout their long lives. Marcus remained composed as he noticed the phones and the activity surrounding him, but there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the implications of what was happening. His carefully guarded privacy, the anonymity that had allowed him to rebuild his life quietly, was disappearing in real time. Victoria Sterling stood in the center of it all, watching helplessly as her worst moment was being documented and shared with the world. But perhaps even more devastating than the public humiliation was the growing realization of what she had become, what her pursuit of success had cost her in terms of basic human decency and self-awareness. James Wellington approached Marcus with genuine concern. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know you valued your privacy here. But people needed to know who you are, what you've accomplished, what you represent." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving around the dining room where conversations were beginning to resume, though in hushed tones that suggested everyone was still processing what they had witnessed. "It's all right, James," he replied. Perhaps it's time to stop hiding from who I used to be and start thinking about how those experiences can serve others. The viral spread of the video was accelerating beyond anything Sarah had expected. News outlets were picking up the story, business schools were sharing it as an example of authentic leadership, and corporate training departments were already discussing how to incorporate Marcus's insights into their programs. The hashtag #MoreThanA was trending as people shared their own stories of being underestimated or misjudged based on their current circumstances. Victoria's associates were both staring at their phones with expressions of growing horror. The younger woman looked up at her boss with something approaching pity. "Victoria," she said softly, "this is everywhere. LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Everyone is sharing it." But it wasn't just the reach of the video that was remarkable, it was the response. Comments were pouring in from people who had been moved by Marcus's dignity, inspired by his wisdom, and touched by his demonstration that true leadership had nothing to do with position or power and everything to do with character. Corporate executives were sharing the video with their teams, discussing what they could learn from Marcus's approach to handling conflict and maintaining dignity under attack. Business school professors were already planning to use the footage in their leadership courses, recognizing a real-world example of principles they had been trying to teach for years. Marcus walked over to Victoria, who was still standing in stunned silence near her table. His approach was gentle, without any trace of triumph or vindictiveness. "Ms. Sterling," he said quietly, "this moment doesn't have to define you unless you choose to let it. You have an opportunity now to demonstrate the kind of leadership that builds people up rather than tearing them down." Victoria looked up at him with tears in her eyes, perhaps understanding for the first time in years what it felt like to be on the receiving end of grace and compassion rather than judgment and attack. "How do you do that?" she whispered. "How do you respond to cruelty with kindness? How do you maintain such dignity when someone is trying to destroy you?" Marcus smiled gently, the expression transforming his face and reminding everyone watching why his students had loved him, why his employees had trusted him, why his sacrifice had meant so much to so many people. "You start by remembering that how others treat you says everything about them and nothing about you," he said. "You respond with grace because that's who you choose to be, not because it's what anyone deserves." The conversation was being captured by multiple phones now, but neither Marcus nor Victoria seemed aware of the documentation. They were simply two human beings, one offering wisdom and the other desperately needing to receive it. "If this story touches your heart," Marcus said, looking around the dining room the faces watching him with rapt attention, "I hope you'll remember that everyone you encounter is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying dreams you might never understand, and deserving of the kind of respect and dignity that makes the world a little bit better for everyone." The words carried beyond the restaurant as the video continued to spread, reaching millions of people who found themselves challenged to reconsider their own assumptions about success, leadership, and the fundamental worth of every human being they encountered. Victoria Sterling's worst moment was becoming Marcus Chen's most powerful teaching opportunity, and the lesson was reaching far beyond anything either of them could have imagined when the evening began. Victoria Sterling's phone had been buzzing continuously for the past 20 minutes, but she ignored it completely. Her attention was focused entirely on the man standing before her, the man whose dignity she had tried to destroy and who was now offering her something she hadn't experienced in years: unconditional grace and the possibility of genuine redemption. The viral videos had reached her own company within minutes. Sterling Industries employees were sharing the footage in internal Slack channels, on professional networks, and in private conversations that would reshape how they viewed their CEO and their workplace culture. The woman they had feared for her sharp tongue and ruthless decision-making was being seen in a new light, and not a flattering one. "Dr. Chen," Victoria said, her voice still shaky with emotion, "I need to ask you something. How do I fix this? Not the public relations disaster, not the damage to my reputation, but this. How do I become the kind of leader you've described? How do I change what I've become?" Marcus studied her face carefully, seeing something he recognized from his years of teaching, the moment when someone's defensive walls finally came down and they were ready to engage in real learning. It was a rare and precious thing, and he approached it with the same care he had once brought to his most challenging students. "Change begins with awareness," he said gently, and you've already taken that first step by acknowledging that change is needed. But real transformation requires more than recognition. It requires the courage to examine the beliefs and fears that drive your behavior, and the commitment to practice new ways of being even when it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Victoria nodded, tears flowing freely now as she processed not just his words but the devastating realization of how far she had strayed from the person she had once hoped to become. Around them, the restaurant had returned to a semblance of normal activity, though conversations remained subdued and many diners continued to steal glances at the extraordinary scene unfolding near the window table. Marcus continued with the patient tone of someone who had guided many others through similar moments of reckoning. The leader you become isn't determined by your title or your authority, he explained. It's determined by how you choose to use whatever influence you have. Every interaction is an opportunity to either build someone up or tear them down, to create psychological safety or to generate fear, to model the behavior you want to see or to perpetuate cycles of harm. Victoria's associates watched in amazement as their formidable boss listened with the humility of a student, accepting guidance from someone she had been attacking just an hour earlier. The younger woman, Amanda, found herself taking notes on her phone, recognizing insights that could transform not just Victoria's leadership but her own approach to managing people. The impact of the evening was still spreading beyond the restaurant's walls. Business schools across the country were already incorporating clips of Marcus's response into their curricula. Corporate leadership consultants were fielding calls from companies wanting to understand how to create cultures of dignity and respect. The video had sparked a broader conversation about power, privilege, and the responsibility that comes with leadership positions. Marcus drew on his years of experience helping executives navigate personal and professional transformation. True leadership development, he said, requires 3 fundamental commitments. First, the commitment to continuous learning and self-reflection. Second, the commitment to seeing and developing the potential in others rather than simply extracting value from them. And third, the commitment to using your influence in service of something larger than your own success. Victoria was absorbing every word, her business-trained mind recognizing frameworks and principles that could revolutionize how she approached her role at Sterling Industries. But more than that, she was experiencing something she hadn't felt in years, hope that she could become better, that her worst moments didn't have to define her future. Dr. Chen, she said, her voice stronger now though still filled with emotion, would you consider coming to Sterling Industries? Not as an employee, but as a consultant, a guide? We need what you have. I need what you have. Marcus smiled gently, the expression carrying both warmth and careful consideration. Ms. Sterling, he replied, I appreciate the offer more than you know. But what I have isn't something that can be purchased or imported into an organization. It has to be cultivated, practiced, lived every day in countless small decisions and interactions. He paused, looking around the restaurant that had become his classroom for the evening. However, I believe deeply in the power of people to change, to grow, to become their best selves when they're given the right support and environment. If you're truly committed to transformation, I'd be honored to help you think through what that might look like. The conversation was being captured by phones throughout the restaurant, but the footage spreading across social media now showed something different from the earlier confrontation. Instead of conflict and humiliation, people were witnessing reconciliation, growth, and the profound impact that grace and wisdom could have even in the most unlikely circumstances. Victoria's phone finally stopped buzzing as her executive assistant, recognizing the magnitude of what was happening, began managing the flood of media requests and internal company communications. The story was becoming bigger than anyone had anticipated, touching something fundamental about leadership, dignity, and the possibility of redemption that resonated far beyond the business world. Marcus looked around the dining room, seeing faces that had been transformed by witnessing this interaction. The elderly German couple was holding hands, perhaps reminded of leaders they had admired throughout their long lives. The young businesswoman was already drafting messages to her team, inspired to bring some of Marcus's insights into her own workplace. The evening had become something none of them could have predicted when it began. A simple dinner service had turned into a masterclass in human dignity, a viral moment that was reshaping conversations about leadership across the globe, and a powerful demonstration that wisdom and grace could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances and create change that rippled far beyond any single interaction. Victoria Sterling was beginning to understand that her true education was just beginning, and that the most important lessons about leadership couldn't be found in business schools or boardrooms, but in moments of authentic human connection where character was revealed and transformation became possible. 3 months later, Marcus Chen stood in the conference room at Sterling Industries, looking out at the faces of executives who had gathered not for a typical corporate training session, but for something far more profound. The viral video from that evening at the Sterling had reached over 50 million views across all platforms, but more importantly, it had sparked a movement that was transforming workplace cultures across the globe. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the table, but her demeanor bore no resemblance to the imperious CEO who had attacked a server months earlier. She had spent weeks working with Marcus, examining her leadership style, understanding the fear and insecurity that had driven her behavior, and learning to see her role as an opportunity to serve others rather than to dominate them. The changes at Sterling Industries had been remarkable and swift. Employee satisfaction scores had increased dramatically as Victoria implemented policies focused on dignity, respect, and recognizing the inherent worth of every team member. The company's stock price had followed suit, with investors recognizing that the cultural transformation was creating sustainable value rather than just short-term profits. Marcus had never returned to his server position at the Sterling, though he remained close friends with James Wellington and the staff who had become his second family. Instead, he had found a new calling, working with organizations that were serious about creating cultures where every person could thrive and contribute their best work. Emma, now 9 years old, sat in the back of the conference room during this particular session, having finished her homework early. She watched her father with the same pride she had always felt, but now she understood in a deeper way why people traveled from around the world to learn from him. Her father hadn't just found a new job, he had discovered a mission that aligned perfectly with his values and his desire to make the world a little bit better. The discussion in the conference room focused on implementing what Marcus called the fundamental principle of dignified leadership, the recognition that every person possesses inherent worth that exists completely independent of their current position, their productivity, or their ability to benefit the organization. Victoria raised her hand, something that would have been unthinkable in her previous leadership style. Dr. Chen, she said, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than defensive challenge, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding psychological safety. How do we measure whether we're actually creating an environment where people feel valued, not just productive? Marcus smiled, recognizing the depth of her transformation. The answer isn't in metrics or surveys, though those can provide useful data, he replied. The answer is in the quality of conversations that happen in your organization. Are people bringing you problems early, when they're still solvable? Are they offering creative ideas without fear of ridicule? Are they willing to admit mistakes and ask for help? Those behaviors only emerge when people trust that they'll be treated with dignity regardless of the outcome. Amanda, Victoria's former associate who was now the company's chief people officer, nodded thoughtfully. We've started implementing weekly reflection sessions where team members can share challenges without fear of punishment, she said. The insights we're gaining are remarkable, and the solutions being generated are far more innovative than anything we achieved through top-down directives. The viral video had created opportunities Marcus had never anticipated. Universities were inviting him to speak, corporations were requesting consultations, and most importantly, individuals were reaching out to share how the principles he had demonstrated were changing their own relationships and communities. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was happening in smaller, quieter ways. The hashtag #MoreThanA title had evolved into a global movement where people shared stories of times they had been underestimated or had underestimated others. Teachers were using Marcus's approach to create more inclusive classrooms. Parents were modeling dignified conflict resolution for their children. Service workers around the world were reporting increased respect from customers who had been influenced by the video. Marcus looked around the conference room, then turned his attention to the broader audience he knew was watching through the live stream that Sterling Industries now used to share their transformation journey with other organizations. If this story has touched your heart, he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had captivated the restaurant that night, I want you to know that you have the power to create moments of dignity and recognition every single day. It doesn't require a title or authority. It simply requires the choice to see the humanity in every person you encounter and to treat them accordingly. Emma smiled from the back of the room, recognizing the words her father had spoken to her countless times. He had taught her that true strength came not from having power over others, but from using whatever influence you had to lift people up, to help them see their own worth, to create the kind of world where everyone could flourish. Victoria stood at the end of the session, her transformation complete not in the sense that growth had ended, but in the sense that she had become someone fundamentally different from the person who had entered the Sterling that evening. Thank you, she said to Marcus, and by extension to everyone who was watching around the world. Thank you for showing us that leadership is not about being served, but about serving others. Thank you for demonstrating that dignity is not something we earn, but something we choose to extend. As people filed out of the conference room, Marcus gathered his materials slowly, thinking about the evening that had changed everything. He had lost his anonymity, his quiet life of simple service, but he had gained something more valuable, the opportunity to reach millions of people with a message about dignity, respect, and the fundamental worth of every human being. Emma ran up to him, her backpack bouncing as she moved. Dad, she said, her eyes bright with excitement, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you'll come speak to her business class next week. She says everyone needs to learn about being a good leader like you. Marcus laughed, scooping his daughter into a hug. What do you think? He asked. Should we share what we've learned about treating people with kindness and respect? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Everyone should know that story, she said. Everyone should know that being mean doesn't make you strong, and being kind doesn't make you weak. As they walked out of Sterling Industries together, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had sacrificed everything to protect others, lost his career and his status, and found himself serving tables in a restaurant. But those experiences had prepared him for this opportunity to serve something larger, to touch lives and change perspectives on a scale he never could have imagined. Thank you for joining us from around the world, Marcus said to the camera that would carry his final words to millions of viewers. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to recognize the dignity and worth of another human being. Subscribe not just to channels or content, but to the belief that we can create a world where everyone is valued, respected, and given the chance to contribute their unique gifts to our shared human story. The screen faded to black, but the message continued to spread, carried forward by everyone who had been touched by a simple truth, that real leadership, real strength, real success comes from recognizing and nurturing the extraordinary potential that exists within every ordinary moment and every ordinary person we have the privilege to encounter.